Devotional. Today we are starting a new series called Difficult to Love, and we're going to talk about really God commissions us to love. 1 John 4 says, "Beloved, let us love one another," and so we know that we're supposed to love. And if you read further into 1 John 4, we find that we really need to love the people who we can see if we say that we love the God that we can't see. And so all that's in 1 John 4, but we're not going to talk about 1 John 4 today. We're going to actually go to another popular love passage, which is in 1 Corinthians. I just want to let you know that 1 John 4 for me is my favorite chapter about love. And then this would be secondary, although it's far more popular. And so we're going to look at 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter. But let me give you pretext to what we're reading, what we're meditating on regarding the scripture, because we could read the scripture and apply it to people who are easy to love. And it would still be a difficult task because it's not easy work to love the way that this passage is instructing us to, but we could apply it to anyone. Instead of just applying it to anyone, I want us to think about the people who are difficult to love. I want us to think about the family members or loved ones or people who are special in our life that are kind of saboteurs, or they make bad decisions. They do the wrong thing. They don't listen. They don't follow instructions. They're complicated. They're rude. Or disruptive. They do the things that make it difficult for them to love. We all know people who are difficult to love for whatever reason. Sometimes it's just because the decisions they make in their life are so bad for them that you find yourself frustrated often with them because they'll disappoint you all the time. So people who disappoint you all the time, that's the kind of person that we're talking about. The people who they need to be around because they're, brothers, sisters, cousins, aunts, spouses, in-laws. So they need to be around children. They need to be around for those reasons because you want to keep the relationship going, but they just continuously disappoint you and make it really hard for you to love them. We're going to talk about, I'm going to reference to this passage in 1 Corinthians, but then we're going to talk about one of the strategies towards loving the difficult to love. And so, and why might they be difficult to love? There's all that. So anyways, the passage is 1 Corinthians 13. Again, it's the love passage, very, very common in weddings, very common, very commonly heard. So you'll recognize it. 1 Corinthians 13, verse 4, and I'm just going to read through verse 8. And so it says, "Love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. And where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away." And then the next is the love never fails. Okay, so love never fails, right? And so when we look at what's happening here, this love that's being described would be extremely complicated when you start talking about people who are difficult, right? These people who disappoint you, who make bad decisions for you or for other people around you. I've known people who've been difficult to love because of the way they treated other people. Not necessarily the way that they treated me or the way they treated themselves, but the way that they treated other people was so cantankerous and so difficult. You're just like, oh my goodness, this person, right? And so sometimes we get into those niches and we have people who are extremely difficult to love. And this passage, though, is kind of pulling us into, well, if you really love them, then this is what love should look like. It always trusts, it always perseveres, it always endures. Like, oh my gosh, it always just basically keeps dealing with the person. And so here goes strategy number 1 for loving difficult people. It is to not ask why. All right. So you're probably thinking, what? So let's go deeper into it. Oftentimes we see a person's behavior and their behavior becomes a stumbling block as to why it makes them difficult to love. They are rude. They are doing things that you feel like they shouldn't do, or they're saboteurs. They're doing all these things that are inappropriate. It's their behavior that we're looking at. But the biggest issue for us comes when we start to see their behavior, we judge it as bad or good or whatever, okay? And sometimes it's obvious that this behavior is counterproductive. Sometimes, okay, it is what it is. It's not subjective. This is just behavior that's not going to get us anywhere good, okay? But then we start to, in our minds, maybe, and sometimes out loud, ask the question, why? Why are they doing it like that? Now, why would they? Now, why are they? Now, what's the reasoning behind? And we start to ask the question, why? And as you can see, I had a little attitude. My attitude started to kick up when I started saying why. Because it's not just a regular why. It's a why with the accusation on the end of it, right? It's a really, why didn't they do it the way they should have done it? Or why didn't they do it the way I wanted them to do it? Why in this regard is a why about with the assumption that it's wrong and it should have been done a different way. Well, why is one of the biggest stumbling blocks for us when we're trying to love those who are difficult to love. And here goes why. Because why? Because why implies judgment, right? It shades the conversation. It shades your perception of this person is already wrong, already misaligned. You start with the judgment. You start with the problem, and the problem is theirs. You can't figure out why this person is doing what they're doing when you wouldn't, right? So the implication in the why is they're doing something that I wouldn't do and I don't understand. And that's not in the passage from 1 Corinthians that we just read. It doesn't say love questions your motives. Always questions motives. That's not in that passage. And the reason why it's not in that passage is because it says it accepts all things. Why? Because at the end of the day, when we're looking at a person and we start to ask the why, we're creating an atmosphere of judgment against that person. And that judgment against that person will inevitably change the way we view that person and make what was already a difficult situation far more difficult. In other words, it's so much harder to love a person you disagree with than it is a person you agree with. And so if you put yourself in the frame of reference of saying, I disagree with you, I don't like the way you did this, I wouldn't have done it that way, then you're loading for them evidence against that person, if it makes any sense. You're loading these things and making your stumbling blocks increase. Like, oh my goodness, and they did this, and they did this, and they did this, and I don't understand why, and I wouldn't have done that, and I wouldn't. So you start running into these places in which you have a hard time getting over their behavior because you have judged their behavior as not the way you would have done it. And so they're difficult to love. But what would happen if you stopped asking why? The same walls that you constructed would start to fall down. It doesn't matter why. It really doesn't, because if you knew why, for one, it wouldn't be good enough. And maybe you asked the question, well, why did you do that? And then they said something, you're like, well, that's just the stupidest thing. Again, the wall gets larger, right? Now you're thinking, oh, now they're just a fool. Oh, what in the world? What kind of reasoning? Oh, that's just an excuse. And so no, it's never going to be good enough. That's the trick. So don't ask why, because why won't get you to the place of love that you're trying to get to, right? Why will just create a longer, taller, bigger blocks for you towards them. It'll create more problems. So if you though say, I won't ask why, okay, then you refuse to allow something else to build on top of what is already a difficult relationship or a difficult person to love. You refuse to let more stumbling things come between you and that person by not trying to assume, judge, or determine why they did what they did, just allowing them to be. And when you allow them to be, you do indeed fulfill this passage that we just talked about. You're in marginally, because it's a huge passage, but you're going in the right direction, accepting all things. Okay. You're not seeking you first. You're not seeking your answer to the why before you're seeking to love them. You're not putting yourself in the wrong perspective regarding their life and their decisions. You're allowing them to make the decisions they love. Now it's going to be, they want to make. Now here goes the thing. I'm not saying it's going to be easy, which is why this is a series, but what I am saying is this: as you allow them to make those decisions and stop questioning all the time the why, you take yourself out of the power seat in this relationship, in this dynamic of loving them, and you put yourself in the seat of submission. And that's really what that passage was talking about, was, can you be loving even if you don't agree? And the answer is yes, but it is a choice. And so stopping the whys is the first step. Tomorrow we'll talk about the next step, but be encouraged that you can just think about the things that you question people for that are difficult to love. You question why. Inevitably, if you don't now, you did when you first started finding they were difficult to love, and it's become a stumbling block. But there is freedom. Stop asking why. All right, I want to encourage you to think about this, meditate on this idea of what happens if I stop asking why? What happens if I stop questioning people's motives and intentions? What would happen if that happened? How would my love relationships be different with the people who I know I'm dedicating myself to love? Well, things will be a lot different in a lot of different ways. But I just want you to know we're praying for you. We hope that you're praying for us as well. But we really want you to consider this passage, 1 Corinthians, the 3rd chapter, verses 4 through 8. But then consider what happens if we remove the why. All right. Until tomorrow, have a wonderful, wonderful day. We will see you then. Bye-bye.